Okay, in this video we're gonna listen to my phone read chapter 18 from this. The painting in the background is some art that I painted last year. I'll make more in the future. And as I said, we discuss chapter 18. It's from this book here, Expressionism and Philosophy by Gilles Deleuze. It's talking about the philosophy of Spinoza. He's written two books about Spinoza. This is the bigger one. It's mainly focusing on the ethics, but it talks a little bit about the political theological treatise as well when he needs to support certain claims that he's making that are contentious about Spinoza. Again, I'm not a Spinoza scholar, and I'm not really a Deleuze scholar either. I've just spent time reading his books. So anyways, without further ado, I'll turn on my phone and have it read to us chapter 18. Now, I'm using the Google text-to-speech function in Easy PDF Reader on Android. And for some reason, it sometimes makes me change the voice back to, I like British male voice 2, or UK English British or voice 2, and sometimes it switches it back to the default female voice. So I always have to go into the settings and change it back. I haven't quite figured out why that's the case, but today it seems like it's fine. Here we go. The other thing is that it often spells out words because the PDF that it's reading from is not particularly the optical character recognition in it didn't work out quite right. So there's things where it reads each letter separately for some words, but I don't particularly care. Some people spend a lot of time manicuring their text files before they have it read, and I guess I'm just comfortable hearing it say the letters too sometimes.
CHAPTEREIGHTEN TOWARDTHETHIRDKINDOFKNOWLEDGE. The different kinds of knowledge are also different ways of living, different modes of existing. The first kind, imagination, is constituted by all inadequate ideas and passive affections in the concatenation. This initial knowledge corresponds first of all to the state of nature. I perceive objects through chance encounters, and by the effect they have on me. Such an effect is but a sign, a varying indication. Such knowledge is had through vague experience, and vague relates etymologically to the random character of encounters. Point 2. Here we know only nature's common order, know only the effects of encounters between parts according to purely extrinsic determinations. But the civil stati also belongs to the first kind of knowledge. Already in the state of nature, imagination forms universal abstract ideas, which retain this or that sensible characteristic of an object. The characteristic is designated by a name, which serves as a sign either for objects resembling the first, or for objects habitually linked with it. Point 3. But along with language and the civil state a second sort of sign develops, which is imperative rather than indicative. Signs appear to tell us what we must do to obtain a given result, achieve a given end. This is knowledge by hearsay. Thus, in Spinoza's famous example, a sign rep, THETHEORYOFFINITEMOOES, resents the operation we must perform on three numbers in order to find a fourth. Whether a law of nature or a technical rule, any law inevitably appears to us in a moral form just insofar as we have only an inadequate knowledge of it. A law seems to us a moral one, or of a moral type, whenever we make its effect depend on an imperative sign, rather than on the constitutive relations of things. It is signs that give the first kind of knowledge its unity. They characterize a state of thought that is still inadequate, involve, unexplained. One must include even the religious state within this first kind of knowledge and existence. The state, that is, of man in relation to a God who gives him a revelation. This state differs from the state of nature no less than does the civil state itself. No one knows by nature that he owes any obedience to God, nor can he attain thereto by any exercise of his reason, but solely by revelation confirmed by signs. For this religious state belongs nonetheless to the first kind of knowledge, precisely because it is part of our inadequate knowledge. because it is based on signs and manifests itself in the form of laws which demand and order things. Revelation is itself explained by the inadequate character of our knowledge, and bears only on certain of God's propria. The signs of revelation constitute a third sort of sign and characterize the religion of the prophets. Religion of the first kind or of imagination. The second kind of knowledge corresponds in the ethics to the state of reason, a knowledge of common notions and through common notions. This is where the real break between different kinds of knowledge appears in the ethics, knowledge of the second and third kinds, and not of the first kind, teaches us to distinguish the true from the false. As we enter, with common TOWARDTHETHIRDKINDOFKNOWLEDGE notions into the domain of expression, these notions are our first adequate ideas. They draw us out of the world of inadequate signs, and because any common notion leads us to the idea of the God whose essence it expresses. The second kind of knowledge also involves a second kind of religion, no longer a religion of imagination, but one of understanding. The expression of nature replaces signs. Love replaces obedience. This is no longer the religion of the prophets, but, on its various levels, the religion of Solomon, the religion of the apostles, and the true religion of Christ founded on common notions. Point 6. But what exactly do we know of these notions? Common notions do not, of course, constitute the essence of any particular thing, and yet one cannot define simply them by the generality. The notions apply to particular existing modes, and have no sense independently of such application, representing, from more or less general viewpoints, the similarity of composition of existing modes. They are for us the only means of reaching an adequate knowledge of the characteristic relations of bodies, of the combination of these relations and of the laws of composition. Once again, this is well seen in the case of numbers. In the second kind of knowledge we do not apply rules known by hearsay, as one would obey a moral law by understanding the rule of proportionality through a common notion. We grasp the way that the constitutive relations of three given numbers are combined. Thus common notions give us knowledge of the positive order of nature as an order of constitutive or characteristic relations by which bodies agree with, and are opposed to, one another. Laws of nature no longer appear as commands and prohibitions, but for what they are, eternal truths. Norms of composition, rules for the realization of powers. This order of nature expresses God as its source, and the more we know things according to this order, the more our ideas themselves express God's essence. All our knowledge, THETHEORYOFFINITEMODES, expresses God when it is governed by common notions. Common notions are one of the fundamental discoveries of the ethics. We must here attach great importance to the chronology. Ferdinand Alki has recently insisted that the introduction in the ethics of common notions marks a decisive point in the development of Spinozism. 7. Indeed, nothing is made of them either in the short treatise or in the correction of the understanding. Things are already known in the short treatise to have characteristic relations, but the discovery of these is entrusted to reasoning, and there is no mention of common notions. 8. In addition, what there corresponds to the second kind of knowledge, the second mode of consciousness, does not constitute an adequate knowledge, but only a right belief. And the third mode of perception, which in the correction of the understanding corresponds to the second kind of knowledge, still amounts only to a clear knowledge, rather than an adequate one, and it is not in the least defined by common notions but by a Cartesian type of inference and an Aristotelian type of deduction. 9. However, one does find in the correction of the understanding, in an altogether different context, a foreshadowing of, and approximately to, what will later become common notions. Thus a famous passage speaks of fixed and eternal things which, from being omnipresent, are for us like universals, or genera of the definitions of singular, changeable things. One recognizes in these the most universal notions: extension, movement, rest, which are common to all things. and when the remainder of the passage argues for still other aids necessary for the understanding of singular changing things. One thinks of the role of less universal common notions. 10. If the passage raises many difficulties, this is because it is written from the viewpoint of the highest mode of perception or kind of knowledge. Relating to essences themselves, laws are inscribed in fixed and eternal things. Says TOWARDTHETHIRDKINDOFKNOWLEDGE. II. Spinoza. As in the true codes, but these laws seem to be the laws of production of essences as well as the laws of composition of relations. How can we explain Spinoza's conflation here of such different sorts of law? I would suggest that he only had an intimation of common notions as he progressed in the composition of the correction of the understanding 9. But he had by then already and otherwise defined the third mode of perception, corresponding to what would become the second kind of knowledge. So constant and eternal things, playing the part of universals, found a place only on the level of the highest kind or mode of perception, and they were thus also taken as the principles of our knowledge of essences. Another role would have been possible, but Spinoza would then have had to go back and recast his description of modes of perception in terms of his new idea. This would partly explain why Spinoza gave up the idea of completing the correction of the understanding precisely at the point where he came to the exposition of what he himself calls common properties. The hypothesis would also allow us to date Spinoza's full development of the theory of common notions between the abandoning of the correction of the understanding and the composition of the ethics. This full possession would then have induced a desire to modify the treatise, reformulating the theory of the second kind or third mode of perception, by giving an autonomous and distinct development of common notions. Thus Spinoza, in the Ethics, speaks of a treatise in which he proposes to develop these points. L2. When Spinoza discovers that common notions are our first adequate ideas, a gap opens between the first and second kinds of knowledge. The existence of such a gap should not, however, lead us to overlook a whole system of correspondences between the two kinds, without which the forming of an adequate idea. 293. THETHEORYOFFINITEMODES. Or a common notion would remain incomprehensible. We have seen in the first place that the civil state was a substitute for rare sun, prepared the way for reason, and imitated it. This would be impossible did not moral laws and imperative signs, despite the contradictions they involve, coincide in a way with the true positive order of nature. So it was indeed the laws of nature that the prophets grasped and transmitted, even though they inadequately understood them. Similarly, a society's primary endeavor is to choose signs and institute laws that correspond as a whole, as far as possible, to the order of nature, and, above all, to man's survival in that order. The variability of signs becomes in this respect an advantage, and opens up to us possibilities that do not belong to understanding on its own account, but rather to imagination. 13. What is more, reason would never come to form more notions, that is, come into its power of action, did it not try to find itself in that first effort that consists in selecting joyful passions. Before becoming active, we must select and link together passions that increase our power of action. But such passions are related to images of objects that agree in nature with us. These images themselves are, once more, inadequate ideas, mere indications which give us knowledge of objects through the effect they have on us. Reason would not then find itself, were its first effort not traced out in the frame of the first kind of knowledge, using all the resources of imagination. If we consider their origin, common notions find in imagination the very conditions of the formation. Considered, moreover, in the practical function, they apply only to things that can be imagined. Thus they may themselves, in some respects, be likened to images. 14. The application of common notions implies, in general, a strange harmony between reason and imagination. between the laws of reason and those of imagination. Spinoza analyzes various cases. He had shown in parts 3 and 4 of the 294 TOWARDTHETHIRDKINDOFKNOWLEDGE ethics under which particular laws of imagination a passion becomes more or less intense, more or less strong. Thus our feeling towards something we simply imagine is stronger than the feeling we experience when we believe the thing to be necessary or necessitated. 15. But the fundamental law of reason amounts precisely to considering things as necessary. Common notions allow us to understand the necessity of the agreements and disagreements between bodies. Reason thus profits from one of the far tours of imagination. The more we understand things as necessary, the less we feel the strength or intensity of passions rooted in imagination. 16. Imagination is subject to a law according to which it always initially asserts the presence of its object, is then affected by causes that exclude such a presence, and enters into a kind of vacillation, thinking of its object only as possible, or even contingent. The process of imagining an object thus contains within it the principle of its own dissipation over time. But Reasson's law is to form common notions, that is, ideas of properties which we always regard as present. 17. Reason here satisfies the demands of imagination better than can imagination itself. Imagination, carried along by its fate, which is to be affected by varying causes, doesn't manage to maintain the presence of its object. Reason doesn't only diminish the relative strength of passions. Taking time into account, the active feelings born of reason or of common notions are in themselves stronger than any of the passive feelings born of imagination. 18. By imagination's law, a feeling is so much the stronger, the more causes act together to provoke it. 19. But a common notion, by its law, applies or relates to several things, or images of things easily associated with them. It is therefore frequent and lively. 20. It thus diminishes the intensity of feelings of imagination, since it determines the mind to consider several objects, and these objects associated with the notion are like so many causes favorable to the 295 THETHEORYOFFINITEMODES feeling of reason which flows from the notion. 2. Necessity, presence and frequency are the three characteristics of common notions, and these characteristics ensure that the notions in a certain way impose themselves on the imagination, either reducing the intensity of passive feelings, or guaranteeing the liveliness of active ones. Common notions use the laws of imagination to free us from imagination itself. Their necessity, presence and frequency allow them to intervene in the movement of imagination, and divert its course to their own ends. It is not too much to speak here of a general harmony of imagination and reason. The greater part of the ethics, more precisely, down to v.21, is written from the viewpoint of the second kind of knowledge. For it is only through common notions that we come to have adequate ideas and an adequate knowledge of God Himself. This does not amount to a condition of any knowledge, but to a condition of our knowledge, insofar as we are finite existing modes composed of a soul and a body. We who have at first only inadequate ideas and passive affections can come into our power of understanding and action only by forming common notions. All our knowledge comes to us through such notions. When Spinoza can say that not even God's existence is known through itself, but must necessarily be inferred from notions so firmly and incontrovertibly true, that no power can be postulated or conceived sufficient to impugn them. 22. The same admission is to be found in the Ethics. Part 1 gives us knowledge of God, and of all things as they depend on God, but this knowledge is itself of the second kind. 23. All bodies agree in certain things, such as extension, movement and rest. The ideas of extension, movement and rest are for us very universal common notions, since they apply to all. TOWARDTHETHIRDKINDOFKNOWLEDGE. Existing bodies. We may then ask whether the idea of God should itself be considered as a common notion, as the most universal of all. Many passages appear to suggest this. 24. But it is not, however, the case. Our idea of God is closely related to common notions, but is not itself one of them. The idea of God is in a sense opposed to common notions in that they always apply to things that can be imagined, while God cannot be imagined. Point 25. Spinoza says only that common notions lead us to the idea of God, that they necessarily give us knowledge of God, and that without them we would not have such knowledge. Point 264. A common notion is an adequate idea. An adequate idea is an idea that is expressive, and what it expresses is God's very essence. The relation of the idea of God to common notions is thus one of expression. Common notions express God as the source of all the constitutive relations of things, as it relates to these notions that express it. The idea of God is the basis of religion of the second kind. For active feelings, active joys, flow from common notions, and they do so accompanied by the idea of God. The love of God is just such joy, so accompanied reason's highest endeavor, insofar as it conceives common notions, is thus to know God and to love him. 28. But this God connected with common notions does not have to respond to our love. He is an impassive God, who gives us nothing in return. 4. However, active joys flowing from common notions are inseparable from those passive joys resulting from imagination, which initially increased our power of action and served us as the occasional causes of our action. And God is him self-free of actions. He feels no passive joy, nor any active joy of the type that presupposes a passive joy. 29. One recalls the methodological principle of the correction of the understanding, that we cannot start from the idea of God, but must reach it as quickly as possible. And the quickest possible way was there presented thus: we had to begin from what? 297. THETHEORYOFFINITEMODES was positive in some idea we had. We strove to make that idea adequate. It was adequate when referred to its cause, when it expressed its cause, but in expressing its cause it also expressed the idea of God as determining that cause to produce such an effect. We were thus in danger of entering an infinite regression from cause to cause. God was expressed at each level as what determined that level of causality. I believe it is wrong to contrast the ethics and the correction of the understanding on this point. The ethics begins with God as absolutely infinite substance no more than does the correction. The ethics does not begin from God as something unconditioned. We have seen the role of its opening propositions in this respect. The project ECT of the ethics is the same as that of the correction of the understanding, to rise as quickly as possible to the idea of God, without falling into an infinite regression, without making God himself into a remote cause. So if the ethics is to be contrasted with the correction of the understanding, this should not be in terms of any change of method, or still less any change of principles, but only insofar as the ethics has found less artificial and more concrete means. These means, up to v. 2.1, are common notions. We no longer start from what is positive in some idea or other. In order to try and form an adequate idea, such a procedure is very unsure and remains indeterminate. We start from what is positive in a joyful passion. This determines us to form a common notion as our first adequate idea. We then form more and more general common notions, which together constitute the system of reason, but each common notion, on its own level, expresses God and leads us to knowledge of God. Every common notion expresses God as the source of the relations combined together in the bodies to which the notion applies. It should not be said that the most universal notions better express God than less universal ones. And, above all, one should not suggest that TOWARDTHETHIRDKINDOFKNOWLEDGE. The idea of God is itself a common notion, the most universal of all, but each notion leads us to it. Each expresses it the least universal along with the most universal. In the system of expression, God is never a remote cause. The idea of God thus plays in the ethics a pivotal role. Everything turns about it, everything changes along with it. Spinoza announces that besides the second kind of knowledge, there is a third. 30. He furthermore presents the second kind as the driving force of the third. The second kind determines us to enter into the third, to form the third. 31. But how does the second kind so determine us? Only the idea of God can explain the transition, which appears in the ethics at v. 20 to 21. 1. Every common notion leads us to the idea of God, as related to the common notions which express it. The idea of God itself belongs to the second kind of knowledge. It represents, in this respect, an impassive God. But the idea accompanies all the joys that flow from our power of understanding, insofar as this power proceeds through more notions. The idea of God is thus the limiting point of the second kind of knowledge. 2. But although it necessarily relates to common notions, the idea of God is not itself a common notion, so it propels us into a new element. We can come to the idea of God only through the second kind of knowledge, but in arriving at the idea we are determined to leave behind the second kind of knowledge, and enter into a new state. In the second kind of knowledge, the idea of God serves as a basis of the third, and by basis must be understood the true driving force, the causa fiendi. 32. This idea of God will itself then change in content, taking on another content in the third kind of knowledge to which it determines us. 2 of the characteristics of a common notion are to apply to several existing modes, and to give us knowledge of the relations through which existing modes agree or oppose. In the 299 THETHEORYOFFINITEMODES limiting case, it is understandable how the idea of an attribute initially appears to be a common notion. The idea of extension is a very universal notion in that it applies to all existing bodies. And the idea of the infinite modes of extension makes known to us the agreement of all bodies from the viewpoint of nature as a whole. But the idea of God, which is joined to, or accompanies, all common notions, leads us to a reappraisal of attributes and modes. Here again, the ethics follows the correction of the understanding. The idea of God affects our entry into the domain of real beings, and the connection. An attribute is no longer understood merely as a common property of all the existing modes corresponding to it, but as what constitutes the singular essence of divine substance, and as what contains all the particular essences of its modes. The third kind of knowledge is defined as proceeding from an adequate idea of the formal essence of certain attributes of God to the adequate knowledge of the essence of things. 33 attributes are still common forms. What has changed is the sense of the word common. Common no longer means more general, that is, applicable to several existing modes, or to all existing modes of a certain kind. Common means univocal, attributes are univocal, or common to God whose singular essence they constitute, and to the modes whose particular essences they contain. In short, a fundamental difference appears between the second and third kinds of knowledge. Ideas of the second kind are defined by the general function. They apply to existing modes and give us knowledge of the composition of the relations that characterize those modes. Ideas of the third kind are defined by the singular nature. They represent God's essence and give us knowledge of particular essences as these are contained in God himself. 34. We are ourselves existing modes. Our knowledge is subject to the condition that we must pass through common notions to 300. TOWARDTHETHIRDKINDOFKNOWLEDGE. Reach ideas of the third kind. Far from being able to deduce the relation that characterizes a mode from its essence, We must first know the relation. If we are to come to know the essence, we must similarly conceive extension as a common notion before understanding it as constituting God's essence. The second kind of knowledge is for us the efficient cause of the third kind, and in the second kind it is the idea of God that allows us to pass from second to third kind. We begin by forming common notions that express God's essence. Only then can we understand God as expressing himself in essences. This condition of our knowledge is not a condition of all knowledge. The true Christ does not proceed through common notions. He adapts or conforms what he teaches as to common notions. But his own knowledge is directly of the third kind. God's existence is thus known to him through itself, as are all essences, and the order of essences. 35 Thus Spinoza says that, unlike Christ, we do not know God's existence through itself. 36 In the natural situation of our existence we are filled with inadequate ideas and passive affections. We will never reach any adequate idea or active joy if we do not first form common notions. Yet it should not be concluded that God is known to us only indirectly. Common notions have nothing to do with signs, they simply constitute the conditions in which we ourselves attain to the third kind of knowledge. Thus the proofs of God's existence are not indirect proofs. In them the idea of God is still grasped in its relation to common notions. But it determines us precisely to form the third kind of knowledge, to enter into a direct vision. There is no text in this page.
Okay. I will take my highlights and reread them and possibly add a few more, and then probably study those again. Get ready for discussing this with everybody on Thursday night at 7:30. If you have questions, comment, or send me a message. Have a great day.